And we are back on our global Node.js Summit on, on our panel discussions with our amazing speakers, Juriy Bura, Fredrik Christenson, Orandi, and Laís Lima. I'm adding them, and don't forget to post your questions. Hey, Juriy, how are you?
Hey guys, I'm good. Thank you very much. It was an amazing few talks that I enjoyed. Thank you for having those.
Hey, y'all. So, first of all, thanks a lot for your presentations. I see that many people liked them, and there was so much support for all of you here. So, the first question, I think this is the most voted question, probably because everybody likes games. And I think, Juriy, the question is for you. So, how to scale socketsio in production and how to manage user sessions?
All right, so yeah, it's actually not very hard, right? Socketio is scaled with a Redis cluster on the backend, so the nodes of the socketio can hold, each node can hold like a few thousands connection, and then you can basically synchronize them with the Redis as the backend. As for the sessions, there is also a technique. It's not very difficult. You can synchronize the session store of socketio together with Express, and this way you will have, for example, the access to the details of the user authentication from the socketio, right? But I'll try to make it sure. There is one more aspect when it comes to game development, right? It's not even a question about socketio, but generally about network scalability. Because once you have like a big number of players in the same location and sending events to each other, even if you are scaling socketio, due to the number of the events, it may be difficult, right? So there are some very smart techniques that are related to like sharding and organization of the delivery, and that is not socketio specific, but rather game dev specific techniques for like MMOs that have few hundred players staying in the same location. Each one is screaming what they're selling or buying and moving around. So there are some ways to scale that as well, but that's way out of the scope of socketio itself.
Anyone want to add something about socketsio? Okay, let's go to another question. And how do you best decouple test data from the test implementation? So I think there will be a lot of opinions here. Who is brave and want to go first?
All right, I guess I can take a shot first. So in terms of like my experience of separating your test data from like the implementation, it requires a lot of collaboration with like your actual like dev team. So like for instance, I've been on projects where I don't have direct database access. I have to work through someone to get into the database, or we've had to make different kinds of arrangements. What I normally have seen success in doing is creating like a dummy database that mocks what the existing database structure is like, having that in the same project, or having the connection to that in the same project, and then having my tests in the same repository that way. Another method that I've normally used is, it's kind of not had the most success, but it's more like having like a singular file, like that, like a JSON object that has particular test data that I need for my tests. If it's a case where my tests are very complex, I wouldn't necessarily use this. But if it's a simple type of application and a simple flow that you're testing, that's what I would recommend in terms of separating and abstracting the two. But yeah, those are two methods that I've normally seen a lot of success with.
Any other opinion?
No, I think that's a great strategy. Personally, I like to generate the data if I can. If, as I showed in my presentation, like a state builder or a similar sort of construct, where if you have access to your database and you know what the models are, you know what the fields are, then you can generate all that information and then just fill in the things that you need. And other more sophisticated solutions include if you have such a thing, such a third party, which is always very complicated to deal with. If you're integrating to some third party and that's part of your environment, well, then if you want to run your tests in a more live-like fashion, I like to suggest that you record the data that goes over the network, which is a fairly sophisticated setup, but you can do that. So you put a proxy between your system and the external system, and then you simply record the sessions as they are going for the network requests as they pass over the network. And then you can actually use that as stubs for your tests.
Other opinions?
I agree with Dan.
That's perfect. So there is a quite philosophical question, and I really like it. How do you decide what to test? Let the holy war begin. Yeah.
That's a good one.
Fight for that.
Do you want the real answer, or do you want the answer everybody says that they don't really do? The real answer is how hard. Okay, let's be honest. So the real answer is how hard is it to do? How hard is it to test? Because this is kind of the problem with test-driven development. Everybody says that they do it, but they don't. It's that simple. There are tons of people out there who will claim that they all the time, like they're always doing test-driven development and so forth. But the reality is that you have limitations, and if the code is hard to test, those limitations are going to come and bite you. So if you're going to say that, oh, I'm just going to be pragmatic about it, there's a different sort of problem, because if you start picking when you test, odds are that the lazy side of you is going to start biting you, and you're going to actually stop writing as many tests as you would if you always said that I will always test things. But it's usually a very individual thing. Some developers try to write all the time, and some developers almost never do it.
Yeah, there are some codes that were written without thinking about tests, which it makes it very hard to write tests to them.
I'll share a little bit, right? I had a very interesting short story. There was once a team that had a low test coverage, and there was due diligence of the standards that company wanted to see in the code, so it wasn't enough. So in one of the sprints, we had a task to increase the test coverage, and after some time, the developer comes in saying that I've done the test coverage increase. Can you please check the pull request, and we'll commit the code and close this task, right? So, and when I'm coming to the person's desk, I'm checking out the code, and turns out that he is calling the methods, but he's not verifying the results. So technically, he increased the test coverage to be like 95% because he's calling the code, the function is executed, but he's not ever testing what the function returns. So obviously the testing for the sake of increasing the test coverage doesn't make sense. It only makes sense to test what may fail, right? And we all know that there are trivial bits that cannot fail, like getters and setters, and object-oriented programming is a perfect example of things that you don't want to test. But also building a fine balance between the different layers of the tests are important. So the unit test versus the integration test versus the end-to-end test. So it's a per project decision, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's a very complicated matter because, as you were describing, it basically comes down to who are you as an individual. Do you like tests? Don't you like tests? Like, if you don't like them, there's nothing I can do as some external entity. I can put as many linters as I want. I'm not going to be able to force you to write a good test without code reviews and other practices. These are where these soft skills that we keep on hearing about and the office culture makes the biggest difference in terms of quality of tests. That's the only real way, at least from my opinion, that you can solve this problem.
I agree. I think this comes back down to the point of an individual, in the sense of there's this theory that's called like tester mindset. When you're approaching coming up with a test strategy or anything like that, you can't think about it as if you're a developer alone. You have to think about it in a different mindset. So I do agree with the point that it is an individual type of decision. What a lot of companies can do is to standardize a lot of the processes around their work, the applications that are being produced. and kind of dictate it a little bit more to their development teams that, you have to test your application in some way. The method in which you do it is also important, because I've seen cases where we have like 200 unit tests going, but they're not really doing anything. Some of them are passing, some of them are failing, and everyone's like, oh yeah, we have test coverage, everything is good, but they're not really doing anything. It's not increasing the quality of what went out, because when it went into production, we still were seeing problems that, we didn't encounter from the test level. And some of these things that were happening had actual tests for them. So it is a bit of a balancing act. What my advice would have been from like a individual standpoint is to kind of change the mindset a little bit. Approach your process of writing tests from a standpoint of, if I'm a user, what are the things I'm going to do with this? If you start thinking about it that way, you're going to now want to write your application in a better way. And also you write your tests with the user first type mindset. And back to the point of like the TDD aspects as well. TDD can be implemented in many ways. It's just like any other methodology or paradigm. It's just down to you as an individual to take the process and make it your own, or make it fit your particular use case.
Yeah, I'll probably add a little bit. Probably we shouldn't be talking about the individual choice here per se, because if we're talking about the individual choices, it can lead quite unpleasant places, right? So I'll give an example, right? So somebody likes to put the semicolons, somebody don't like to put the semicolons. It's trivial, but still we enforce certain code style with limiters, etc., to have the code of industrial style. So it's like faceless. You read the code and you cannot tell in the perfect world who wrote this code, right? By this looking at the style. Same for the test, right? It is the part of the industrial standard. So if we're building industrial quality software, the testing approaches must be standardized and accepted by the team, right? Otherwise, I'm not sure that this personal affection towards writing tests or not writing tests will be beneficial for the team if we're talking not about a single developer, but a little bit larger organization.
I agree. But that's my point. I would say that it's an office culture type of thing, because you as a team have to decide that you value testing enough to make that part of your process. And sure, you can add a coverage tracker on top and just to kind of work as a reminder. I like to suggest that you should have a coverage tracker, not for the sake of quality, but rather for the sake of those days when you are tired, with those days when you're stressed and so forth. You have something that actually keeps you on track. But at the end of the day, you have to have a coworker relationship with peer reviews and code reviews that actually emphasis how important it is with quality tests on top of that, because otherwise it's kind of pointless. My favorite one, which usually happens when people are not already buying into test-driven development, it usually, I argue, you grow into test-driven development, because usually what happens is you start at a low scale, small scale, you start working towards the point where the code has now grown to a point where the people maintaining that code can no longer keep everything straight in their head, because in the beginning they feel like they don't need tests because I already know everything and I basically make no mistakes. But at some point the system is so large that they're actually getting more and more errors, and then they're open to having the discussion about working in a test-driven fashion. And that's where test toil, as I was referring to in my little presentation, is going to be a factor, because some people want to write a lot of tests and some people don't want to write any tests, and you have to make it easy because you need everybody to do it.
That's a very good point. I totally agree. Even I remember, I can't remember who exactly said it, but one of the big minds of software engineering was saying that legacy code is the code without the tests, right? So if you're writing code, you're coding without the tests, you're pretty much writing legacy, because if you're not there, it's probably going to be hard to figure out what exactly this code does, if it is supposed to work this way or it accidentally works this way. So.
My favorite one, it happens all the time, and this is why I really do. I tell coworkers, and I've done it myself as well. I love it. I come to a piece of software that is completely untested, and there's, you're adding two numbers together and dividing by another number. What does that mean? I have no idea. It's because that's the problem. The test is not just, as we were saying, it's not just for you. It's for me as well as the secondhand consumer. Because if the specification for the feature is just in your head, The second you go and get sick or you quit the job, I can't help my company anymore because I don't know what this code is supposed to do. Especially if it's like a third party, and ideally an undocumented third party API that takes some magic code. I don't know what it does.
Exactly.
Right.
Makes perfect sense. One of my friends who was justifying not writing tests, like half joke, he was saying, I was suffering when I was writing this code, so you should be suffering when you're reading it.
I love that guy. Sounds like an amazing standpoint. I mean, if you don't write tests and you implement all these features, it's a really good way to keep yourself employed because you get really important.
That's true. That's true. And to be honest, COBOL developers are still very, very much employed. So,
That's
yes.
true.
Fair point.
So, like, you all speaking about like importance of the testing, and how do you sell testing to your teams? Because obviously you got a lot of people who like, I don't like writing tests.
That's. I honestly believe that the only way to sell it is through highlighting the amount of issues and pain that you actually have. My favorite one is to start by moving towards a tracking system. I know nobody wants to time track, but if you measure how much time you're actually investing in fixing a bug, and you compare that to how much time it takes for you to write the test, and if, as I was saying, make sure that it's easy to write the test, you will see that there is a benefit here. Especially if if you're on pager duty or something like that, that's also a really good one. Make them own the operations process because that's going to be super fun to be woken up in the middle of the night because.
I agree. I agree. Like steps like that is what I've normally seen like success with. For myself personally, it was a type of conversation of like I had to take that development team from where they were in terms of what is it that you know, what are the things that you're into, and then I started to plug into the gaps in terms of where they're lacking in terms of getting started with testing and so on. So I started from a very foundational level. It's an actual ongoing process right now. So I started from a very foundational level of giving them like testing theory and so on and so forth, like showing them what's a mock, what's a stub, showing them the testing pyramid and things like that to show them what the theory is, and then take them from that stage and start to integrate it into their workflow over time. And with that type of approach, have seen some success in it where the mindset is now changed. Actually, before I took them to writing automated code, the team was starting to do test cases. So we had one designated QA on the team, and that person was only writing manual test cases. We started to expand that to the dev team. So now the dev team is writing code, and then they're writing manual tests. Of course, they hated it in the beginning. It's something that they despised very much because we're taking up a lot of time. A task that would take 2 hours is now taking 4 because now you have to write test cases to match your feature. But after they got into the groove of it, that 4 hours started to cut down into like 2 or even 1 hour. Sometimes, they got really good at it. And then they started going into the process of, okay, how do I write this in using like a Jest or a Cypress or one of these types of frameworks? And then we started to see more success. And then the quality of what was coming out from the dev team started to improve. So kind of taking it from like an incremental standpoint like that is where I've seen a lot of success. And I think it works.
I mean, it's like selling the tests to the team. It sounds awkward, to be honest, a little bit, right? So it's already industry standard. The unit testing has been around from the early. It was like before Java even, right? In Smalltalk, it was already a thing, right? So trying to sell testing to the team almost feels to me like trying to sell that you need to wear a helmet on the construction site to a construction worker, right? So it's kind of, it's bulky. It's not as nice as with a hair, but if the brick falls into your head, it kind of helps, right? So, but still, if it comes to the point where I need to sell it, usually I try to take the bit of code that is like obviously poorly written, poorly designed, and then I'm saying let's try to make it testable, right? And as you try to make it testable, you try to decouple the bits of the code, restructure it in the way that it has independent entities. At the end of the day, once you accomplish the task of making the code testable, testing the code, you see that the code itself has transformed into a much better shape. And if you need like an obvious reason that, except for the regressions, except for going forward and not being afraid to introduce the change, but purely right now on the code quality level, that usually helps. Right? So I would advise trying to do that, sitting together, covering it with tests, showing that it became better.
Okay.
It's always hard to change behavior because that's fundamentally what the problem is. Because as Jury was saying, if this is supposed to be an industry standard, and if you're not seeing that sort of result within your team, then you have a problem and usually it is related to people changing their workflow. And everybody loves changing their workflow, right? Everybody loves that. That's so fun. Yeah. And it's a hard sell. And that's why I really believe that your first natural step should be to start measuring the amount of work and effort that goes into it, because that works on two levels. One level is that if you can, you should always go to your team first, because these are, after all, the people that you are collaborating with. And if they won't listen, if you've done the prep work, and this is a big ask, especially if like you're a junior developer or something like that, because you're going to have to gather up enough data to prove your point. When you have that data and this team doesn't listen, then you can bring it up to a management level. And then you can actually put the screws a little bit to the team and say to management, this is the amount of time we're spending on testing, and see if you can approach it from that angle. And then the management might go in and say, all right, then we want you to put emphasis on testing. Because something that I've seen many times is that some developers go, I'm so stressed all the time. The deadline is like tomorrow every single day, and I don't have time. I just don't have time to do a test because I feel like I'm stressed all the time. And then you have to create this environment in the office where you feel like you actually do have the time to emphasize testing.
Thank you. That's a very warm discussion in public chat as well. So I think our viewers will appreciate if you will join that after that panel. So one more question about testing frameworks, because we are kind of speaking about testing in Node.js. So you all spoke about a lot of testing frameworks, like there are tons of them, and now I previously worked with JavaScript, now I'm working with Python, and I'm always like surprised how many choices you have to test the code in JavaScript. So the question is, how you're selecting JavaScript testing framework? Like, what will be a tool in your software development life process?
I'm going to go super opinionated on this one and say that I agree on that Jest is probably the best choice at this point. And I'm just going to put it out there because it used to be the case that Mocha was the hottest thing ever because it was like one of the most foundational things. The only reason I say that I think that Jest is a better approach is because it actually encapsulates, as Laís was kind of showing you earlier, it encapsulates all the other framework, all the other tools that you might have been depending on, like Shy, Sign-On, etc., etc. It's all under one roof, and that is a very beneficial thing because then you need to learn one thing, and you're always guaranteed that there is no problem with different packages with different contributors changing things in between. Because if it's all under one roof, it's being developed with a holistic mindset.
Yeah, I agree with you because in the old days we had the Shy, Sign-On. I don't know to speak in English well, Sign-On, and other libraries in test, and just encapsulate it all in one tool. So I think the Jest, I agree with him. I think the Jest is the best tool to test today with JavaScript. As the backend, as the front end, it well.
Yep. Yeah. Like my personal stack is always includes both Jest and TypeScript. They are like the two biggest, the best investments that you, in my opinion, you can make if you want to be serious about Node.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of this conversation too, when I am asked a question, I always reply to the dev team that it's a matter of use case. Like, what are you trying to do? So if it is that you are setting up unit tests or you want to use the sign-on and Mocha and Chai and these other things, yeah, Jest would be a good choice. If it is that you're trying to do something else, then I would recommend a Cypress or I would recommend a WebDriver IO. But the the other side to having all these different options is that, yes, it is opinionated. It is super opinionated, but it is a conversation with like your team, and to some extent, if you want to go this far, to like upper management, if they dictate the tech stack that a development company uses, to talk to them about what is the best one, like what gives you the best return on your investment, what is the easiest one to use right now. For me, I just got started into Node.js like two years ago now. At that time, I learned about Mocha and Cucumber, so I thought, okay, those were the only options, so let's just use that. And then I found out about Chai, then I found out about what Sign-On is, I found out Jasmine, and I just kept finding out new and new frameworks. And then Cypress came along, and they said Cypress is going to kill all Selenium-based frameworks. So it was just like, okay, what do I really do? And in my experience with all of them, I just found out that it is dependent on the use case. So this is an example that I normally use. Say you're doing an end-to-end test and you want to check your application across several browsers. Using a Cypress would not necessarily be the best option because it's not Selenium based, so you can't automate using Safari or using Firefox or anything like that. But you can do that in WebDriver.io, where you can reach to Firefox and IE11 and Edge and all these other browsers if you want, with relative ease. And that's just the kind of conversation you have to have with a team when you're picking the framework. Don't pick it because it's the hot and latest thing. Pick it because it fits your use case.
It's the biggest, I would say, hidden talent of any JavaScript developer today, and that is to have the ability to make good bets on libraries. It is the hardest thing. It's like the hardest thing you can. If you can master that, you're gonna be like human gold to your employers.
Agreed.
Okay, so another question to Jury probably. So, how to add security around socketsio?
Well, okay, depends. Again, depends what kind of security we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about the authentication authorization, as I said, you can mix and match it with your Express.js socket store, and you can implement any kind of the authentication strategy. Again, think about socketio, it's just a transport, right? So it wraps around the WebSockets or long polling, so it does not have the concept of security in itself per se. The question is, what is the way to secure the underlying protocol, right? So WebSockets are possible to secure in transit, so this is not an issue to encrypt the traffic, right? And with the help of some additional connections between socketio and whatever is the other server that you're using, Express or Happy or whatever it is, it shouldn't be an issue to add the authentication to start off with, right? Now, if we're going slightly deeper, who can execute what, who can listen to what, that should be assessed on the case-by-case basis, right? So making sure that the user will only receive the messages that are intended to that user. User cannot subscribe to something that they are not allowed to see. And here, the principles will be pretty much the same as with securing the APIs. So in principle, this is no different from calling the REST API and saying, hey, here I'm John Doe, and I want to delete the whole database. Can I do that, right? So it's nothing really special about socketio in this perspective, and it makes it actually quite good. It's a framework around protocols, and the security comes as the kind of orthogonal dimension to it.
We will switch to testing again, but first there is like most voted question. What is the best approach to be followed while creating an enterprise-level application with plenty of live updates using Socket? Any resources or open source projects that we can refer to?
Well, that really depends, right? So depends on the architecture and kinds of updates. Are those like frequent updates? Like, do you have a stock market application and you have the stocks jumping in the window, and there are 5,000 users that are listening to the same data, or it's the data that is individual to this specific user? How big is the volume of that data, right? So you cannot. It's like how to optimize my application, right? So this is the question of the similar nature. Depending on the nature of your application, the bottlenecks may be in different places, right? So parallelizing scaling horizontally, those are the typical approaches to do that. But how exactly to scale horizontally in the way that will be effective, that's a question, right? So it is quite hard to answer those questions without knowing the context. There are no general, like, yeah, just tick this box and compile with this flag and it will just fly, right? Unfortunately.
Great. And I think one of the most interesting option for testing is how can I build test for a threads functionality? So if you got many threads, what to do then?
Threats, you're talking about some type of attack on the system.
No, threads, like background thread.
Okay, threading. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
All right. Threads.
Like,
I'm not sure I understand the question.
To be honest, I'm as well.
I would answer that in Java,
Like,
right?
are we talking about the load situation here, or because I mean, if you're dealing with Node, that's a no-brainer. It's a single-threaded environment unless you're using workers or something like that. But that shouldn't matter because ideally you shouldn't have state dependency between the threads.
Yep,
that's true.
If it's a load situation,
that was most voted question, one of the most voted questions. So I decided to give it a shot.
All right.
From my Java world background, I mean, the testing that to say that you're like taking the Node.js out of the context, right? Generally with the threads, testing the threaded code is usually like akin to the black magic, right? It's kind of hard to test that your code doesn't have deadlocks, right? It's easier to design the code in a way that it doesn't have deadlocks, because like proving it formally, if somebody figures that out, it's going to be a big thing.
Whole different problem.
Sorry, I was just going to say this comes back to the situation of knowing what to test and how to do it. So like a question like this is approaching like, how did you design the architecture behind your application, and like what is exactly that you're trying to do? It might be, I guess the question was targeted at a high level, but it might be smaller than that, but you have to dig into the specifics of what exactly it is that you're looking at.
One strategy for the threaded application that I can think of is just executing like a massive payload, but it's based on probability, right? So you're trying to test not some sort of like you can add 2 and 3, and at the end you get 5, and if you don't get 5, then it's wrong, right? But rather, if you have like a massive amount of data, let's say I'm building the banking applications, and there are the notion of transactions moving from one account to the other, right? And I want to test that due to the issues with the threads, I will not have the double charging or something similar problems, right? So one way to do that would be to generate a large enough amount of the test data, knowing the state at which the system should arrive, right? And running those payloads and checking against the resulting state. But again, this is more of a probabilistic thing than the actual like strict testing strategy.
Thank you. So I think we need to finish this. There are a lot of questions, and please join the chat, start asking in Slack. I do think that there is so many topics we can discuss. And for our speakers, I want to read one comment. It's like, I've been since 5 a.m. here for 11 hours, and I'm going crazy right now, lol, but I want to see all the content. And this is all is happening because of you, because of your amazing presentation, and I would like to say thank you. Thanks for delivering your speeches on this amazing event. And feel free to hang out here or like speak with people and all of that stuff. Thank you
very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we got a couple of more minutes till our next speech, and we are starting new block. So get a beer, get some snacks, and we'll be back soon in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.
All right.